The wind howled through the corridors of the ducal palace in Wolfenbüttel, rattling the stained glass windows with an urgency that seemed almost prophetic. The heavy oak doors groaned under the pressure of the storm outside. But within the grand hall, the flickering candlelight cast long, uncertain shadows over the faces of the assembled noblemen. Among them, standing in quiet dignity, was Elisabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel-Bevern, her hands clasped tightly before her, knuckles white with tension. She had been summoned here, not as a participant in the grand decisions that shaped the fate of nations, but as an object of discussion, a pawn in a game played by kings. Her father, Ferdinand Albert II, Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, sat at the head of the room, his expression stern, though not unkind. He was a man who understood duty, and if his heart ached for his daughter, he did not show it. The marriage proposal had come from Prussia itself, from none other than King Friedrich Wilhelm I, the fearsome soldier king, a man known as much for his military discipline as for his ruthless domestic policies. Elisabeth Christine had known this day was coming. As a princess of one of the empire's noble houses, her fate had never been her own to decide. But now, as she listened to the voices around her, the weight of inevitability settled upon her chest like a stone. Prussia is a rising power, one of the advisors was saying, and the match is a great honor. A great honor. She swallowed hard. She had met Friedrich, Crown Prince of Prussia, only once. Years before, she recalled a strikingly intelligent young man, sharp-eyed and refined, with none of his father's coarse and brutal mannerisms. But she also remembered the whispers, the rumors of his rebellion, his desire to flee his father's suffocating rule, and worse yet, the scandal. Years earlier, Friedrich had attempted to escape to England, seeking refuge from his father's tyranny. The plan had failed, and his closest companion, Hans Hermann von Katt, had been executed before his very eyes. It was said that Friedrich had been forced to watch the beheading, a warning from his father never to disobey again. Now, that same prince, brilliant, defiant, and deeply wounded, was to be her husband. Elizabeth turned to her mother, Antoinette Amalie of Brunswick, her eyes pleading for some form of intervention. But her mother only gave a gentle nod, her gaze filled with something that looked almost like pity. "The arrangements will proceed," Duke Ferdinand said finally, his voice a quiet decree of fate. "Elisabeth Christine shall be Queen of Prussia." The wedding took place in 1733, a grand ceremony held in the heart of Prussia, designed more for political spectacle than love. Every detail had been meticulously planned by King Friedrich Wilhelm I, who saw his son's marriage as nothing more than another piece in his grand vision of a militarized and efficient kingdom. Elisabeth Christine arrived in Berlin amid great fanfare, her carriage rolling through streets lined with curious spectators. The city was a place of rigid discipline, its people hardened by years of the soldier king's iron rule. The women of the court, dressed in dark, severe fashions, watched her with measured interest, whispering behind their fans. Friedrich was there to greet her, standing at the steps of the palace, dressed in the immaculate uniform of a Prussian officer. His expression was unreadable. She descended from the carriage, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no warmth in them. She had prepared herself for an arranged marriage, for the absence of passion. But the sheer indifference in Friedrich's gaze was something else entirely. He looked at her as though she were a duty to be endured, a contract fulfilled. The ceremony itself was grand but hollow, a performance before the gathered aristocracy of Europe. As the vows were exchanged, Elizabeth forced herself to remain composed, reciting the words that bound her to a man who barely acknowledged her presence. That night, as tradition dictated, they were led to the bridal chamber. But Friedrich did not touch her. Instead, he turned away, his hands resting on the windowsill, staring into the night. "I did not choose this," he said finally, his voice low, almost bitter. "And neither did you." Elizabeth swallowed, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "I know." He turned to look at her then, studying her face as though seeing her for the first time. There was something in his expression, curiosity, perhaps, or resignation. "I will not be cruel to you," he said after a long pause. "But do not expect love." And with that, He left the room, leaving her alone in the vast, cold palace that was now her home. Days turned into weeks, then months. Elisabeth Christine did what was expected of her. She attended court functions, smiled when required, and upheld the dignity of her title. But she was little more than an ornamental presence, a figure of ceremony while her husband withdrew into his own world. Friedrich spent most of his time at Rheinsberg Palace, surrounding himself with philosophers, musicians, and intellectuals. He had no interest in the rigid traditions of his father's court, nor in the woman he had married. Elisabeth, left behind in Berlin, found solace in her books, in music, and in quiet conversations with the few ladies of the court who showed her kindness. She developed a particular fondness for theology and history, subjects that offered a sense of order in a life that felt increasingly uncertain. But loneliness gnawed at her. She heard rumors, of course, of Friedrich's friendships, deep, intense relationships with men of his circle, of whispered conversations in corridors that stopped when she approached. She was not naive. She knew that whatever his heart was capable of feeling, it was not for her. And yet, she remained dutiful. When King Friedrich Wilhelm I summoned her, she went. When the court required her presence, she appeared. And when Friedrich himself returned to Berlin, she stood beside him, the ever-faithful queen. But there was no mistaking the truth. She was Queen of Prussia in name only. In 1740, Friedrich Wilhelm I lay dying. The once mighty soldier king, who had ruled with an iron fist, had been reduced to a frail, withered figure. His final days were spent in paranoia and regret. His once commanding voice now a weak rasp. Friedrich was summoned to his father's bedside, and though the two had been estranged for years, the crown prince obeyed. Elisabeth was not allowed into the chamber. She waited outside, listening to the muffled sounds of their final conversation. The words were never recorded. But when Friedrich emerged, his face was set with a new determination. The soldier king was dead. Friedrich was now king of Prussia. Elisabeth watched as courtiers rushed to swear their allegiance. As the great machinery of state shifted around the new ruler, she saw the way his posture changed, the quiet confidence that now radiated from him. This was not the man she had married. This was Friedrich the Great. The first months of Friedrich's reign were a whirlwind of activity, a carefully orchestrated transformation that he had long planned. The young king wasted no time in dismantling much of his father's rigid and oppressive court structure, surrounding himself instead with philosophers, writers, and military minds who shared his vision for Prussia's future. He dismissed old ministers, reorganized the military, and drafted ambitious policies that would reshape his kingdom. He was a ruler with a purpose, and he pursued that purpose with relentless energy. But amid the flurry of reforms and preparations for war, one figure was conspicuously absent from Friedrich's plans: his wife, Queen Elisabeth Christine. She watched from a distance as her husband built his own court at Sanssouci Palace. Far from Berlin, far from her, it became clear almost immediately that he had no intention of including her in his rule. Not even in a ceremonial capacity. The role of a queen consort, as dictated by tradition, was to stand beside her husband, preside over court functions, and serve as the symbolic heart of the monarchy. But Friedrich had no use for such traditions. Elisabeth Christine was given a residence in Schönhausen Palace, a beautiful but isolated estate north of Berlin. She was surrounded by courtiers and attendants. But in truth, she was alone. Friedrich rarely visited. When he did, their conversations were brief, polite, and distant, exchanges between two strangers bound by duty rather than affection. On one of his rare visits, she gathered the courage to ask him about her role in his reign. She had seen other queens take on diplomatic responsibilities, acting as intermediaries between foreign courts, and she wondered if she might be useful in some way. Friedrich looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he said simply, "Your duty is to exist." The words were spoken without malice, but they stung all the same. He had meant that she was to be a figurehead, a necessary presence for the sake of appearances, but nothing more. She would never advise him, never influence policy, never share in his triumphs or his failures. She was Queen of Prussia. But she would never be a queen in his eyes. Elisabeth Christine was not the first noblewoman to be trapped in an unwanted marriage. And she knew she would not be the last. But she had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that she might at least find purpose in her position. Now, that hope was fading. Friedrich's true passions lay elsewhere. He spent his time with his closest advisors, debating military strategy and Enlightenment philosophy. He corresponded with Voltaire, the great French philosopher, exchanging letters filled with wit, politics, and personal reflections. And then, of course, there were the rumors. In the quiet corridors of Schönhausen, whispers traveled fast. It was said that Friedrich had no interest in women at all. There had never been mistresses, no passionate affairs, no secret lovers hidden away in the shadows of the palace. His relationships, those that truly mattered, were with men. His circle of intellectuals, musicians, and soldiers. Some spoke in hushed voices about his past, about the deep, intense friendship he had shared with Hans Hermann von Katt, the young officer whose execution had been ordered by Friedrich's father. Elisabeth Christine did not know the truth of these rumors, nor did she particularly care. What mattered was that Friedrich had no love to spare for her. She had been brought to Berlin to be his wife. But she was not his companion, not his partner, not even his friend. She turned to her books for comfort, as she had in the early days of their marriage. Theology, philosophy, history, she devoured them all, seeking knowledge where love had failed her. Yet even in her isolation, Elisabeth Christine remained resolutely dutiful. She attended every public event when summoned. She played her part at court, hosting dignitaries and foreign guests when Friedrich was away. She supported charities, funded religious institutions, and ensured that Prussia's aristocracy saw her as a graceful, devoted queen. The people admired her, the courtiers respected her, but her husband remained indifferent. Then, in 1741, a new chapter of Friedrich's reign began, a chapter that would test his rule and reshape Europe itself. The War of Austrian Succession had begun, and Friedrich saw his chance to claim the rich, contested province of Silesia. He marched his armies south, engaging in brilliant, ruthless military maneuvers that would earn him the admiration of soldiers and kings alike. He was no longer just a philosopher king, he was proving himself as a warrior king as well. For 4 long years, Prussia was at war, while Friedrich commanded his troops in the field. Elisabeth Christine remained in Berlin, maintaining the royal court in his absence. She performed her duties with quiet diligence, ensuring that state affairs continued smoothly despite her husband's absence. Though he never acknowledged it, she played a vital role in maintaining order, giving the Prussian people a sense of stability while their king fought for glory. But no matter how much she did, it was never enough to earn Friedrich's approval. When he returned in 1745, victorious and celebrated, he was greeted with parades, music, and the adoration of his people. Prussia had won Silesia, and Friedrich was hailed as one of the greatest military minds of his time. Elisabeth Christine was there at his side during the celebrations, smiling as expected, offering congratulatory words that he barely acknowledged. He had won his war, secured his place in history, but his wife was as invisible to him as ever. That night, as they stood on the balcony of the palace, watching the fireworks explode over Berlin in honor of Prussia's triumph, Elisabeth Christine finally dared to ask, "Are you proud of what you've done?" Friedrich, still watching the fireworks, gave a small, knowing smile. "Proud?" he exhaled, as if the word amused him. "No, but I am satisfied." She turned to him, searching his face. "And will you ever be satisfied with me?" For the first time in years, he truly looked at her. There was no cruelty in his gaze, no anger, just honest resignation. "You are a good woman, Elisabeth," he said softly, "better than I deserve." Then, without another word, he left her standing there, alone beneath the shimmering lights of a city that cheered for a king who had forgotten his queen. The year 1740 was a turning point in Prussia's history. In the cold chambers of the royal palace in Potsdam, the once mighty King Friedrich Wilhelm I lay on his deathbed. The man who had ruled with an iron fist, who had turned Prussia into a military powerhouse, who had beaten his son in public and executed his closest friend, was now reduced to a frail, wheezing figure. Outside his chamber, courtiers whispered in hushed voices. Everyone knew what came next. Elisabeth Christine sat in a quiet antechamber, hands folded in her lap, waiting like everyone else. She had never been close to her father-in-law, nor had she particularly feared him as Friedrich had. But she understood what his passing would mean. Somewhere beyond these walls, her husband was about to become king. The door to the chamber finally opened, and Friedrich stepped out. His face was unreadable, his eyes dark with something she could not name. The courtiers fell into deep bows, murmuring their rehearsed words of loyalty. Elisabeth Christine rose to her feet, searching Friedrich's expression for any trace of grief. But there was nothing. His father was dead, and he did not mourn. There was no coronation. Friedrich despised such pompous displays and saw no reason for an elaborate ceremony. He was king the moment his father stopped breathing. And that was enough. The first thing he did was begin undoing everything his father had built. The old court was dismissed, the suffocating traditions cast aside. Friedrich surrounded himself with artists, writers, philosophers, thinkers, not soldiers. He wrote letters to Voltaire, debating the meaning of kingship, the responsibilities of a ruler, the place of reason in governance. He spoke of an enlightened monarchy, a kingdom ruled by intellect rather than brute force. But for all his lofty ideals, Elisabeth Christine remained conspicuously absent from his plans. She had hoped, foolishly, perhaps, that his ascension might change things between them, that with his father's shadow gone, Friedrich might see her not as a burden, but as a partner. Instead, he moved to Sanssouci Palace, his personal retreat, where he surrounded himself with men who shared his passions. The Queen of Prussia, his wife, was left behind in Berlin, cast aside like an inconvenient afterthought. The court gossiped about it. Of course, they whispered about the king's refusal to see his wife, about the young men and intellectuals who occupied his time instead. Some questioned why he had not sought an annulment, why he kept a wife he would not touch, would not love, would not even acknowledge. But Friedrich had no interest in an annulment. Elisabeth Christine served a political function, and that was enough for him. For her, it was another kind of imprisonment. The years passed in a strange kind of limbo. Elisabeth Christine continued to fulfill her duties, attending court events, playing the role of queen even when her king refused to stand beside her. She devoted herself to charity work, to education, to the quiet, dignified tasks expected of a woman in her position. And then, in 1740, Friedrich shocked the world. Only months after taking the throne, he invaded Silesia. It was an audacious move, one that defied every diplomatic expectation. Austria, under the rule of Maria Theresa, had assumed Prussia would respect old agreements. That Friedrich, so publicly enamored with philosophy and reason, would not march an army into her lands without provocation. But Friedrich was not just a philosopher. He was his father's son. The invasion of Silesia set Europe on fire. War erupted across the continent, and Prussia found itself at the center of a storm it could not escape. Elisabeth Christine watched from Berlin, helpless as her husband became something greater than a king. He became a legend. News of Friedrich's victories spread like wildfire. The Battle of Mollwitz, where his troops defeated the Austrians against all odds, was hailed as a masterpiece of military strategy. Prussia, once a mere player on the European stage, was now a true force to be reckoned with. And yet, even as Friedrich's fame grew, his distance from her became absolute. For 4 years, he waged war. For 4 years, she waited. She attended court functions, held diplomatic meetings in his absence, kept the capital running while he played his great game on the battlefield. And then, in 1745, the war ended. Prussia emerged victorious. Silesia was theirs. Friedrich returned to Berlin, a hero, a conqueror, a ruler who had defied the great powers of Europe and won. Elisabeth Christine stood in the great hall of the palace, waiting to greet him as protocol demanded. The room was filled with ministers, generals, noblemen, all eager to bask in the glory of the man they now called Friedrich the Great. When he entered, The room erupted in applause. She stood among them, clapping politely, watching as her husband, the husband she had barely seen in years, accepted the praise with his usual measured grace. When their eyes finally met across the room, there was nothing in them. No recognition, no warmth, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. It was as though she were a stranger standing among his courtiers, rather than his wife. And in that moment, Elisabeth Christine understood the truth. She had lost him completely. Perhaps she had never truly had him at all. That night, Berlin celebrated. Fireworks lit up the sky. The streets were filled with cheers, music, and drunken revelry. Prussia had changed forever, and Friedrich had secured his place in history. Elisabeth Christine watched the celebrations from a palace window, standing alone in the darkness. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder. If she had never been married to Friedrich, if she had never come to Prussia, never been forced into this life, who might she have been? The answer was lost beneath the sound of cheering. The echoes of victory lingered in Berlin long after the celebrations had ended. Friedrich had returned to his palace at Sanssouci, retreating into the world he had carefully crafted for himself, one of music, philosophy, and military planning. The people of Prussia hailed him as a genius, a king unlike any before him, a warrior and a scholar. His name was spoken with reverence, his presence sought after by the greatest minds of Europe. But amid this newfound glory, Elisabeth Christine remained in the shadows, forgotten by the very court she was supposed to preside over. Her role as queen had never been significant, but now, it was barely acknowledged at all. While Friedrich expanded Prussia's influence across Europe, she remained in Berlin, a prisoner in all but name. She still attended ceremonies when required, still maintained a presence at state events. But the truth was undeniable: the Prussian court did not revolve around her. Nor was she even a part of it. Friedrich's circle was composed of intellectuals, generals, and artists. He had no interest in the usual trappings of monarchy. He despised elaborate court rituals, had no time for noblewomen seeking favor, and viewed the pomp of royal life as an unnecessary distraction. And if he had little regard for his court, he had even less for his wife. Elisabeth Christine lived at Schönhausen Palace, her residence in Berlin, separated from Friedrich in every meaningful way. She was given wealth, attendance, and the outward trappings of queenship, but no authority, no companionship, no place at the king's side. She was a queen without a court, a wife without a husband. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Elisabeth Christine filled the silence with books, with music, with small acts of kindness toward those around her. She sponsored charities, gave aid to religious institutions, and provided for the poor of Berlin, quietly earning the love of the people even as her husband ignored her existence. She knew how she was spoken of among the courtiers, the forgotten queen, the wife left behind, the shadow of a throne that belonged only to Friedrich. And yet, she endured. Letters from across Europe arrived at the Prussian court, filled with praises for the great Friedrich the Great, the king who had defied Austria, who had reshaped the political landscape of Europe. Voltaire himself wrote frequently, exchanging ideas with Friedrich, debating philosophy, art, and the future of governance. Their correspondence became legendary, a symbol of the Enlightenment era. But nowhere in these letters, nowhere in the vast archives of Prussian history, was there mention of his queen. Once, long ago, she might have hoped for his respect. But now, she simply hoped to be remembered. Friedrich's court at Sanssouci was his world, and there was no place for her in it. He lived among men who admired his genius, who fed his intellect, who saw him not as a husband or a ruler but as a philosopher-king, a man above the ordinary concerns of family and duty. Even when he returned to Berlin for official matters, he never visited her. He was a king of war, of strategy, of ideas, not of love, nor of marriage. And so, Elisabeth Christine became a ghost. She watched from afar as Friedrich shaped history, carving out victories on the battlefield, turning Prussia into a great European power while she remained unseen, unheard, forgotten. But she refused to disappear entirely. If she could not be his queen in practice, She would be a queen in action, in dignity, in presence. She dedicated herself to public service, funding hospitals, orphanages, and religious institutions. She became known for her generosity, her kindness, her unwavering sense of duty, even in the face of rejection. While Friedrich ruled from the battlefield and the halls of power, she ruled in quiet acts of compassion. The people of Prussia, the common folk, the poor, the sick, they did not care that their king ignored her. To them, she was a true queen, not in power, but in spirit. But no matter how much she gave, Friedrich never noticed, or if he did, he never let it show. And so, the years continued. She lived without a court, without a king, without a place in the history being written around her. But she would not be erased. Not yet. The year 1756 brought a new storm upon Europe, one that would stretch across continents, entangling nations in what would later be called the First True World War. It would be fought not only in Europe, but in the Americas, in India, and across the seas, as great empires vied for dominance. For Prussia, it was a war of survival. For Elisabeth Christine, it was a war that would define her existence, not through battle or diplomacy, but through her quiet, unrecognized role in holding Prussia together while her husband fought for its very survival. Friedrich's invasion of Saxony in 1756 set off a chain reaction that would lead to one of the most devastating conflicts of the 18th century. The war pitted Prussia and Britain against a coalition of Austria, France, Russia, Sweden, and the Holy Roman Empire. It was an alliance forged to crush Friedrich the Great, to wipe Prussia from the map, to undo everything he had built. Elisabeth Christine did not fight on the battlefield. She never held a sword, never rode at the head of an army, never commanded troops. But in her own way, she fought a war just as difficult, just as lonely, just as vital. When Friedrich marched to war, he left behind a kingdom that needed to function in his absence. And that duty, whether he acknowledged it or not, fell upon his queen. For years, she had been ignored, cast aside, treated as an afterthought. But now, when Friedrich had no time for the daily governance of Prussia, it was Elisabeth Christine who ensured that the realm did not fall into chaos. Berlin became a city on edge, with Prussia surrounded by enemies. Every day brought new anxieties. Would Austria push into Silesia? Would the Russians sweep down from the east? Would the French and Swedes attack from the west? And over everything loomed the greatest fear of all. What if Friedrich fell in battle? The war did not start well for Prussia. The coalition against Friedrich was too powerful, too well supplied, too determined to see him destroyed. The first battles tested even his legendary military skill. The Prussians were outnumbered, their resources stretched to the breaking point. Reports from the front lines reached Berlin in waves of fear and desperation. And as Friedrich and his armies bled on the battlefield, it was Elisabeth Christine who stood firm in the capital, holding the kingdom together with quiet resilience. She maintained the stability of the court, ensuring that ministers, nobles, and foreign diplomats remained focused, that Prussia's internal affairs did not collapse while the king was away. She used her connections among the noble families of Europe to secure quiet alliances, to maintain diplomatic relations where Friedrich had made enemies. She ensured that aid and resources continued to flow to the Prussian army, using her influence to support war efforts even when Friedrich refused to acknowledge her role. She became a silent guardian, the hidden force ensuring that when Friedrich returned from war, there was still a kingdom left to rule. And yet, he never wrote to her, never sent word of gratitude, never acknowledged that his forgotten queen had become the backbone of his fragile empire. The war dragged on. 1757 brought disaster. The Battle of Kolin was a crushing defeat for Prussia. The Austrians, led by Field Marshal Daun, destroyed Friedrich's forces, forcing him into a desperate retreat. Berlin descended into panic. For the first time, it seemed possible that Prussia might truly fall. Elisabeth Christine did not panic. Even as some members of the court whispered of surrender, even as diplomats quietly suggested negotiating with Austria, she stood firm. Prussia would not surrender, not while Friedrich still fought, not while she still had the power to keep the kingdom standing. And then, in the same year, Prussia shocked the world. At the Battle of Rossbach, Friedrich turned the tide. With a smaller army, outnumbered by a combined French and Imperial force, he delivered a stunning victory, proving that Prussia would not be crushed so easily. The news of the victory spread like wildfire, and Berlin erupted in celebration. Elisabeth Christine ordered a grand ceremony in the city, ensuring that the people remembered not only Friedrich's victories, but their unity as a nation. Then came the Battle of Leuthen, where Friedrich again defeated the Austrians in one of the most celebrated military campaigns of his career. Prussia was still in the war. Against all odds, it endured, and so did Elisabeth Christine. She continued to manage the affairs of state, to work tirelessly behind the scenes to keep Prussia from falling apart under the strain of war. Still, no letters came from Friedrich. No words of thanks. No recognition that, while he waged war, she had ensured that Prussia did not collapse from within. As the years passed, the war only grew worse. By 1760, Prussia was exhausted. The coalition forces had overrun much of Friedrich's territory. Berlin itself was briefly occupied by the Russians. For the first time, the war came to Elisabeth Christine's doorstep. She refused to flee. She refused to abandon her post. Even as Russian troops marched through the streets, she remained in Berlin, a symbol of resilience for the people. A queen who would not bow, even as her city fell. And then, a miracle. In 1762, the Empress of Russia, Elizabeth, died. Her successor, Peter III, was an admirer of Friedrich. Overnight, Russia withdrew from the war, shifting the balance of power. By 1763, the war was over. Against all odds, Prussia had survived. The Treaty of Hubertusburg confirmed that Prussia would retain Silesia. Friedrich had defied an empire, outmaneuvered kings, and carved his place in history. He returned to Berlin a hero, victorious once again. And still, he did not see her. Elisabeth Christine was there, as always, waiting at the palace. She had done everything, held the capital, kept the government from collapsing, reassured the people, endured years of war in the king's absence. She had protected his kingdom when he could not. And when Friedrich the Great walked through the halls of the palace he had nearly lost, he passed his wife without a word. No thanks. No recognition. Not even a glance. She had held Prussia together. And he never even noticed. The years following the end of the 7 Years' War were not kind to Elisabeth Christine. While Friedrich the Great's military genius had elevated him to the status of a European legend, a philosopher king admired by thinkers across the continent, his queen was once again forgotten. Prussia, emerging from the ashes of the war, was now more than a kingdom. It was a symbol of resilience. An embodiment of the Enlightenment ideals that Friedrich had so passionately championed. He became Europe's darling philosopher, exchanging letters with Voltaire, hosting the greatest intellectuals of the time at Sanssouci Palace, and espousing the virtues of reason, liberty, and justice. To the world, Friedrich was no longer just a monarch, he was a beacon of enlightenment. A model for other rulers to follow. But as his influence spread across Europe, his wife remained nothing more than a distant, forgotten presence in his life. Elisabeth Christine, despite the contributions she had made during the war, continued to live at Schönhausen Palace, a place that was now little more than a symbol of her isolation. She attended the occasional court function, but even when she did, Friedrich paid little to no attention to her. She had long given up any hope of romantic connection with him, of ever being more than a silent figurehead. But the indifference with which he treated her cut deeper as the years passed. Friedrich was a man of intellect, of ideas, of ambition. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Prussia's future, with the advancements that could be made in philosophy, in governance, in the very nature of man's existence. He was surrounded by men who shared his vision, who elevated him to heights no one had thought possible for a king. To the world, he was a man ahead of his time, the embodiment of reason and enlightenment. He engaged in exhaustive correspondence with the likes of Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau, exchanging thoughts on liberty, the nature of kingship, and the role of the state in the life of the individual. But for Elisabeth Christine, the growing intellectual community that surrounded her husband felt like another chasm between them. She had never been a philosopher. She had never cared for political theory or the abstract discussions that filled the air in the halls of Sanssouci. She was a woman of action, of duty. And though she had lived up to that role as queen, it had always been in a practical, grounded sense, raising funds for hospitals, providing for the poor, maintaining the appearance of order in the court. Friedrich, on the other hand, was now a man who thought far beyond the practical world. His mind soared above the concerns of everyday governance. And in that realm of high ideals, Elisabeth found herself increasingly irrelevant. She had never been allowed to participate in the intellectual discussions that so consumed her husband. He made no attempt to engage her in the affairs of the state. Nor did he ever solicit her opinion. In fact, she often felt that her presence in the royal court was more for show than for substance. Her very title seemed to be a vestige of a time when monarchy had been more about familial bonds and less about intellectual prowess. Even the philosophical movement that Friedrich helped foster seemed to have little place for her. Voltaire, who had become one of Friedrich's closest confidants, often praised the king's enlightened approach to governance, calling him the philosopher king. Yet there was no mention of Elisabeth Christine in their correspondence. No acknowledgement that behind the great man's successes was a queen who had sacrificed years of her life in silence. And it wasn't just the intellectuals who ignored her. The court, too, became increasingly distant. The nobles who had once looked to her for guidance now turned their attention to Friedrich's intellectual companions. To the brilliant men and women who frequented Sanssouci, Elisabeth Christine was no longer the queen with any real influence. She was merely a relic. A quiet observer of a court that had moved beyond her. She still performed the ceremonial duties of a queen, hosting dinners for foreign dignitaries, attending official functions, and maintaining the appearance of royal dignity. But behind the smiles and the appearances, she was simply a woman abandoned by her husband's intellect. Friedrich had become a philosopher king, and there was no place for her in the world of ideas that he had created. The loneliness that Elisabeth Christine had felt in the early years of her marriage was now compounded by the growing sense that she was a ghost in her own kingdom. She no longer had any connection to the man she had once hoped to be close to. She no longer had any place in his intellectual world. She was simply there, standing at the periphery, watching as Friedrich the Great became a legend, and she remained his forgotten queen. And yet, there was one thing that still tied her to him: duty. Elisabeth Christine continued to fulfill her royal obligations. Even as her personal life with Friedrich became increasingly strained, she continued to serve the kingdom in her own way, even as she was shut out of the very conversations that shaped the future of Prussia. But there was little joy in her service. She had long since come to terms with the fact that her life was no longer her own. She was a queen without a king, a wife without a husband, and her role in the grand scheme of things had been relegated to that of a figurehead, nothing more than a silent guardian of a monarchy that no longer seemed to need her. In the quiet, private moments when she allowed herself to think, Elisabeth Christine sometimes wondered how she had come to this point. How had she gone from a young woman full of hope and duty, eager to serve her husband and her kingdom, to a woman isolated and forgotten? How had her life become so devoid of meaning, of purpose? She had never imagined this would be her fate. Perhaps it had been inevitable. After all, she had married a man whose mind was too grand, too focused on ideas, to see her as anything other than a necessary political alliance. She had known from the beginning that love was not part of the equation. But she had hoped that duty might bring them closer. But duty had not brought them together, it had driven them further apart. And now, as Friedrich became more deeply enmeshed in the world of intellectuals and philosophers, she remained a woman who had no place in his life, no place in the kingdom he was shaping. She had become irrelevant, a queen without a court, a wife without a king. And as she wandered the halls of Schönhausen Palace, she couldn't help but feel that history was moving on without her. Friedrich's fame only grew. He was celebrated not only in Prussia but across Europe as one of the greatest monarchs of his time. His military successes, his reforms, and his intellectual pursuits became the stuff of legend. Prussia flourished under his rule, and he became an icon of the Enlightenment, a monarch who believed in the power of reason over tradition. A ruler who sought to improve the lives of his people through education, reforms, and the application of philosophy to governance. But for Elisabeth Christine, there was no place in this new Prussia. She had become an afterthought. A woman whose presence was acknowledged only when necessary, but never truly valued. Her thoughts turned inward, and in the quiet moments of solitude, she grieved for the life she had never lived. She grieved for the love that had never come. She grieved for the queen she had been forced to become, and the woman she had been forced to leave behind. But in the end, she knew one thing for certain: she had fulfilled her duty. Even if no one would ever acknowledge it. Friedrich had built a legacy, but it had been built without her. And yet, through it all, she had remained, standing quietly, waiting in the shadows, a queen without a court. As Prussia entered the 1760s, the echoes of the 7 Years' War slowly faded, though the scars it left on the kingdom were deep. The kingdom had won, yes. Prussia had survived the storm, but survival came at a price. The victories that Friedrich had won on the battlefield were now distant memories. And the political landscape of Europe was once again shifting. Friedrich had secured his place in history. But as the years passed, his eyes were fixed not just on his intellectual pursuits but on one question that hung like a shadow over his reign: who would follow him? Prussia had no clear heir. Friedrich the Great had never married for love, nor did he see a reason to have children. He had devoted himself entirely to the state, to his kingdom and his ideas, to his philosophy and the future of Prussia. But time marched on, and with it came the undeniable truth: he was not invincible. Though he remained strong, the weight of his years began to show. He was no longer the vibrant, youthful king who had once defied the odds and led his army through wars. He had not yet reached the age of 60, but he was weary. His mind remained sharp, but his body, battered by years of constant warfare, was not as resilient as it once had been. He was beginning to realize that he could not rule Prussia forever. Friedrich's succession crisis began to grow more pressing with every passing year. In truth, he had never thought much about the future beyond his reign, never cared for the politics of inheritance or family ties. But now, with the question of succession hanging over him, he found himself turning inward. He had no children, no heirs, no plans for the future beyond his own lifetime. His marriage to Elisabeth Christine had been a political necessity, a tool in the larger game of power, and it had never produced an heir. As Friedrich's health declined, the question of succession became less about politics and more about reality. Prussia needed a clear successor. Without an heir, the kingdom could descend into chaos after his death, divided between rival factions seeking control of the throne. The strength of his rule, and the future of Prussia itself, depended on a clear and uncontested line of succession. Friedrich turned to his nephew, Friedrich Wilhelm II, the son of his sister Wilhelmine of Bayreuth. He was young, charismatic, and ambitious, traits that Friedrich respected, though he remained wary of the political alliances that would come with such a choice. Still, with no other options, he began to prepare his nephew for the throne. He began making plans for a smooth transition of power, plans that would, in time, make Friedrich Wilhelm II not only a possible heir, but also a strong candidate to carry Prussia's mantle forward. But what did this mean for Elisabeth Christine? For the queen who had been sidelined for years, the question of succession felt like a final rejection. She had never been allowed a role in the grand scheme of governance. Her role as queen had always been ceremonial, a necessary formality for the sake of appearances. She had never been consulted about political decisions, had never been asked for advice or guidance. She had given years of her life to this kingdom, performed her duties without question. And yet now, as Friedrich turned his attention to the future, she found herself pushed even further to the margins. Her son, Frederick William II, was a member of the royal family, but he was young and untested. Elisabeth Christine had not been able to shape his destiny, had not had a hand in his upbringing. Now, the fate of the Prussian monarchy seemed out of her control. In the corridors of Sanssouci Palace, Elisabeth Christine's presence was little more than an afterthought. As the years passed and Friedrich became more withdrawn, she continued to maintain her duties as queen. She still oversaw the affairs of her court, still hosted dignitaries, still represented the royal family at formal occasions. But in reality, she was no longer a true queen. She was a woman whose role had been eclipsed by the towering figure of her husband. And now, by the looming question of succession. As Friedrich began to groom Friedrich Wilhelm II for the throne, he made it clear to those around him that his nephew was the future of Prussia. Elisabeth Christine's role had always been one of subjugation to the king's will. And it seemed that her role was now fading away entirely. She had no part in her husband's plans for the future. She was not consulted about the succession, not involved in the discussions that would determine Prussia's fate after Friedrich's death. The thought of her son ascending the throne filled Elisabeth Christine with a sense of deep loss. She had never been allowed to play a part in the formation of the kingdom she had sworn to serve. She had never been given the opportunity to shape her family's future. In her quieter moments, she would often reflect on her life and wonder where it had gone wrong. She had once hoped that by marrying Friedrich, she would have found a place in the world, a place beside him, but that had never come to pass. Now, as the question of succession dominated the court's affairs, she found herself at the mercy of a kingdom that had never truly been hers. As Friedrich's health continued to decline, the once proud monarch became more introspective, more concerned with the legacy he would leave behind. The future of Prussia was now in the hands of his nephew, Friedrich Wilhelm II. But what would this future look like? Would Prussia continue its journey as an enlightened state, as Friedrich had envisioned, or would it fall into the hands of a new, less thoughtful ruler, one who did not share his great-uncle's ideals? For Elisabeth Christine, the future had become a source of deep uncertainty. Her husband, her kingdom, and her son, they were all slipping away from her. In the final years of her life, she would come to accept that she had always been a pawn in the game of kings. Someone who had given everything to a kingdom that never truly valued her. She had spent her entire life serving a man who never once saw her as an equal. And now, in her final years, she found herself standing in the shadow of a new king who had not even been born when she first married Friedrich. And yet, despite the bitterness of these realizations, she carried on, for what else could she do? She had fulfilled her duty. As she always had, she had supported the monarchy, had worked tirelessly for the future of the kingdom, even if that future was no longer hers to shape. The question of succession loomed over her final years. Would she remain the forgotten queen, forever outshone by the legacy of a husband who had never truly loved her? Or would her son, the young Friedrich Wilhelm II, carry her name into the future? Even if she would never live to see it, the shadow of succession, it seemed, would forever haunt her. As the 1770s unfurled, Prussia's monarchy, once a powerhouse of military genius and intellectual ambition, began to show signs of wear. King Friedrich the Great, despite his towering legacy, was now a ruler fading into his twilight years. His influence was still felt across Europe, but his physical strength was failing. His mind, sharp as ever, was now weighed down by the realization that he could not live forever, and that the kingdom he had built might not survive without him. In these later years, Elisabeth Christine found herself more isolated than ever, a queen whose significance had been reduced to mere formality. The court in Berlin, though still dignified, had long since stopped looking to her for guidance. With Friedrich's eyes on the future and his focus on grooming his nephew, Friedrich Wilhelm II, Elisabeth Christine began to feel not only forgotten, but utterly invisible. Despite her earlier devotion to her royal duties, she now found herself in the rarest of positions, a monarch who no longer mattered. While Friedrich Wilhelm II, the young heir, prepared for his own eventual rule, Elisabeth Christine was gradually overshadowed by the impending change. Friedrich Wilhelm, filled with youthful ambition, had no use for the older queen who had never been more than a distant presence in his life. He often dismissed her at court, preferring to confer with ministers and generals on matters of state. His association with the intellectuals who frequented Sanssouci Palace further distanced him from his late aunt, whom he viewed not as a source of wisdom but as someone who was, at best, a symbol of the old Prussia, a monarch who had failed to find a true place in the ever-evolving world of enlightenment. Elisabeth Christine, despite being the queen, found herself relegated to a position of utter irrelevance in the final years of her life. The court, where once she had been an active, if silent, figure, was now a place where she was ignored by most, even by the new generation of rulers and courtiers. They had no personal connection to her, they had no need for her. And they had long stopped pretending otherwise. Friedrich, despite his philosophical prowess, was also acutely aware of his own mortality. Though he lived with the constant reminder of age, he remained focused on the intellectual pursuits that had defined his reign. While his health continued to deteriorate, his body had grown frail and he began spending more time in seclusion. Retreating to his inner circle of advisors, military leaders, and intellectuals, he continued to rule Prussia with the sharp mind he had always had. But he rarely spoke to his wife, the queen, even in the quiet of their private moments. Elisabeth Christine watched as Prussia was carried forward into the future, a future she had no part in creating. A future that was not hers to guide. She felt the creeping loss of something deeply personal, her own legacy. While Friedrich's triumphs had been celebrated across Europe, his wife's contributions were no more than footnotes in a history that had no space for her. She had sacrificed so much for Prussia, her life, her hopes, and her youth, and in return, she had received little more than apathy from the very system she had helped to uphold. In 1772, when Friedrich suffered his most significant health crisis, the nation felt a deep unease. The fear that Prussia might fall apart without a clear heir was palpable. While Friedrich's advisors scrambled to ensure the smooth transition of power, Elisabeth Christine, ever the dutiful queen, remained in the background, a silent observer to the unfolding events. She had once hoped for a place at the center of things, for recognition, for acknowledgement of her quiet support. But she had been forgotten. In the king's final years, she watched as everything she had once held dear began to slip away. The death of Friedrich Wilhelm II's father, and his eventual coronation as the new king of Prussia in 1786, was the final chapter of Elisabeth Christine's long, increasingly lonely tenure. She had never been consulted about the succession, had never played a role in the preparations for the kingdom's future. And in those final days of Friedrich's reign, the old queen found herself in a strange limbo, a monarch without a court, a woman without a role, and a history without a place. While Friedrich Wilhelm II ascended to the throne, Elisabeth Christine's existence was reduced to mere history. Her efforts, her sacrifices, her years spent in the service of the crown, went largely unnoticed, overshadowed by the towering legacy of a man who had long disregarded her. But even in her seclusion, even as her body began to weaken and her influence faded, Elisabeth Christine refused to fade into obscurity without leaving behind a final testament to her own dignity. She spent her remaining years in quiet contemplation, reflecting on the choices she had made, on the duties she had fulfilled, and on the kingdom that had never truly been hers. She never gave up on her role as queen, though the kingdom she had once served was now under new leadership. She was still, in her heart, a guardian of the crown, even as she was cast aside by those who no longer saw her as relevant. In her last years, Elisabeth Christine found solace not in the grandeur of the court but in small moments. She found comfort in the traditions she had helped uphold, in the quiet work of charity, and in the silent reflection of a life lived with purpose, even if that purpose was never fully acknowledged. When she passed away in 1797, Friedrich Wilhelm II had already solidified his reign, moving Prussia forward with the vigor of youth. But her death went largely unremarked by the court. The old queen, the forgotten queen, passed quietly, without fanfare, without ceremony. Her passing was a final testament to the life she had lived, a life spent on the margins. A life reduced to nothing but the backdrop of a kingdom that had long since moved on. And yet, despite it all, she had served faithfully, she had done her duty. And though history had forgotten her, she had never forgotten her kingdom. She had been the queen without a court, the silent guardian of a monarchy that had outlived her. The year 1786 came like a quiet storm, heralding the inevitable change in the monarchy of Prussia. King Friedrich the Great, whose military genius and enlightened rule had shaped not only his kingdom but the very course of European history, was dying. He had been ill for some time, but as the cold grip of illness took hold of him, it became clear that his reign was nearing its end. The once proud monarch, who had defied the odds in battle and in diplomacy, was now an old man who could not escape the inevitable march of time. Friedrich had seen it coming, and in the days leading up to his death, he focused not on his own legacy but on the future of Prussia. He had worked tirelessly to secure the kingdom, but now, he turned his thoughts toward his nephew, Friedrich Wilhelm II, who would inherit his crown. Though the transition of power was not without anxiety, Prussia's future depended entirely on the young king's ability to maintain the fragile balance Friedrich had crafted. The passing of the old king was an event that would change the face of Prussian history forever. For Elisabeth Christine, this moment marked the final chapter of a long and unacknowledged service to the crown. She had stood by Friedrich for so many years, fulfilling her duties as queen despite being ignored, forgotten, and overlooked. But even in the final moments of Friedrich's reign, she had no place in the king's passing. Her role, which had never been more than a peripheral one, was now entirely erased. She was a queen without a court, a woman without significance in the kingdom she had once helped to uphold. When Friedrich the Great finally passed on August 17, 1786, the news swept across the kingdom. The public mourned the death of the man who had led them through wars and triumphs. His intellectual contributions, his military victories, and his bold reforms had made him an icon of the Enlightenment era. As the king's body was prepared for burial, his legacy was already secured, and Prussia would not forget his achievements. His name would live on in history. But in the shadow of his death, Elisabeth Christine stood alone, left to navigate the world without her husband and without her place. She had spent her life in the quiet service of a kingdom that never acknowledged her. And now, as her last remaining days drifted by, she was again reminded of the deep isolation she had felt for so long. While the kingdom moved forward, celebrating Friedrich's victories, Elisabeth Christine was left to wonder, what had been her purpose? She had married into a kingdom, given her life to it, and watched as history unfolded around her. Yet, despite her years of service, she had never been a part of the kingdom's story, at least not in the way that she had once hoped. She had been a shadow queen, a figurehead with no real influence, a woman who had seen her role reduced to nothing but a ceremonial one. Even in the wake of her husband's death, she was not called upon to contribute to the future of Prussia. The new king, Friedrich Wilhelm II, was young and full of ambition, with plans of his own for the future. Elisabeth Christine was, once again, a relic, a reminder of a time when things had been different. A time when she had been expected to serve. Friedrich Wilhelm II's ascension to the throne was met with a mixture of enthusiasm and apprehension. He was a young king, filled with energy and ideas. He had been groomed for this moment by his great-uncle. But the question remained, could he live up to the legacy of Friedrich the Great? Elisabeth Christine's place in this new era was unclear. She was not invited to play a role in the transition of power. She had fulfilled her duties as queen, had borne the weight of her title for decades. But now, in the twilight of her life, she was no longer needed. Her son, Friedrich Wilhelm II, had no particular affection for her. He had always seen her as little more than a background figure in the larger drama of Prussian power. And now, as the new king took his place, Elisabeth Christine was a woman without a title, without a role. The court mourned Friedrich the Great's passing, and the kingdom held a funeral that marked the end of an era. The great philosopher king was buried with honors, his body laid to rest in the Church of Peace in Sanssouci, surrounded by the symbols of his reign and his victories. As the kingdom looked to the future, Elisabeth Christine could only watch from the sidelines as the world moved forward without her. The passing of her husband, the great Friedrich the Great, left her in a strange position, caught between the old and the new. A queen who had never truly been recognized. A woman who had given her life to a kingdom that had never cared for her. She spent her final years in the quiet solitude of Schönhausen Palace. Her life reduced to nothing more than a footnote in Prussian history. She was not remembered with the same reverence as her husband, While the kingdom celebrated the legacy of the great king, Elisabeth Christine was a woman who had never been allowed to be more than a symbol of duty. The royal court carried on, unmoved by the passing of the forgotten queen. Yet, even in the quiet of her isolation, Elisabeth Christine held her head high, for she knew that her role in the kingdom, no matter how forgotten, had been one of duty, loyalty, and sacrifice. Her passing in 1797, over a decade after her husband's death, was marked by little ceremony. She had outlived her usefulness, outlived her place in the royal family, and yet, she had lived out her days in service to Prussia. When she passed, there was no great outpouring of grief from the people, no grand recognition of her years of quiet loyalty. She was buried in the same tomb as her husband, but unlike him, her grave was unadorned with the weight of history. In the end, Elisabeth Christine's life was defined by quiet, unacknowledged service, a monarch without a true place in her kingdom's narrative. Yet, despite all that had been taken from her, she had carried on. Her legacy, though hidden in the shadow of great men, was one of dignity, perseverance, and strength, traits that defined her as much as any of the kings and generals who had shaped her world. Her death, though barely noted by the kingdom, was a final silence, marking the end of a life spent in the service of a monarchy that would never remember her as it had remembered Friedrich the Great. But for those who understood her role, she would always be the queen who had stood in the shadow of greatness. A woman whose loyalty had never wavered, even as the world turned its back on her. The dust of history settled upon Elisabeth Christine as she passed quietly into the annals of Prussian memory. Though her death in 1797 marked the end of an era for the royal family, it was not met with the grandeur one might expect for a woman who had once held the title of Queen of Prussia. The court, having long since turned its attention to Friedrich Wilhelm II and the future of Prussia, scarcely acknowledged her passing. She was another forgotten figure, a relic of a bygone time, tucked away in the shadows of the kingdom she had faithfully served. But her passing marked something deeper, a quiet turning point not just for the Prussian monarchy, but for the kingdom itself. With the death of Friedrich the Great, the passing of Elisabeth Christine signified the closure of a chapter that had once held such potential. Even if that potential was never realized, her life had been spent in the service of a kingdom and a husband who never truly saw her. And now, with her death, she was left to be forgotten, overshadowed by the men who had shaped her fate. However, in the hearts of the people, there was a quiet recognition of the sacrifices she had made. Elisabeth Christine had been a queen, not of military triumphs or intellectual achievements, but of sustaining the kingdom during its most vulnerable hours. She had held the line, not in the spotlight, but in the quiet work of maintaining stability, of ensuring that Prussia did not crumble under the weight of its challenges. She had done what was expected of her, even when that role was never defined, and perhaps most poignantly, even when she was not allowed to share in the success of her efforts. Her funeral, a modest affair compared to the grand ceremonies that followed her husband's death, was private, with few attending, save for her closest family members. It was a quiet, unremarkable conclusion to a life that had been defined by unrecognized loyalty. Yet, even in her final moments, she maintained her dignity, just as she had throughout her years as queen. Her burial was simple, not in the grand tombs reserved for monarchs, but rather in a more humble resting place. Friedrich Wilhelm II, having ascended the throne with the vigor of youth, moved forward with his own plans for the kingdom, consolidating power, modernizing Prussia, and attempting to shift the kingdom's focus away from the past and into a new future. The legacy of Friedrich the Great loomed large over his reign, but Elisabeth Christine's legacy was relegated to the margins of history. While the new king charted his own course, Elisabeth Christine's quiet service was largely forgotten, a footnote to the great achievements of those who had truly shaped Prussia's destiny. In the years that followed, the memory of the old queen began to fade even further. The courtiers who had known her in the years of her quiet reign moved on, and those who had heard whispers of her forgotten role passed into obscurity as well. The stories of her loyalty, her perseverance, her unacknowledged sacrifices, would be swallowed by the tide of history. overshadowed by the towering legacy of Friedrich the Great and the reforms of Friedrich Wilhelm II. Yet, as the years passed, something in the kingdom began to shift. A quiet re-evaluation of the past. By the early 19th century, as new generations of historians began to look back on the reign of Prussia's great kings, they started to recognize the quiet, unseen work of those who had contributed to the stability of the kingdom. It was here, in the dusty archives of historical records, that Elisabeth Christine's name began to surface again, not as a queen whose reign had changed the course of history, but as a woman who had borne the weight of a kingdom without ever asking for recognition. Her name, once all but forgotten, was now associated with a different kind of legacy, one that was more subtle but no less important. Her role as a supportive queen, one who had ensured the continuity of Prussia during Friedrich's absences. One who had quietly held together the court and the kingdom during the 7 Years' War and the chaos that followed, was finally being acknowledged in the annals of history. While Friedrich the Great was celebrated for his military genius, Elisabeth Christine's contribution to the stability and survival of Prussia in those difficult years was starting to emerge from the shadows. Historians began to write of her as the steadfast queen, the woman who had borne the weight of the throne even when it was not hers to command. Though her efforts had always been overshadowed by her husband's towering legacy, there was now a recognition that her quiet strength had allowed Friedrich the Great to focus on his wars and reforms without worrying about the kingdom falling apart in his absence. She had done her duty, not for fame or recognition, but for the future of the kingdom. As the 19th century unfolded, Elisabeth Christine was no longer the forgotten queen. Her name, though still not as celebrated as those of her husband or son, became associated with the unsung role of queenship, not the power behind the throne, but the power in silence, the strength that held the pieces together when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. Her loyalty and perseverance became virtues that historians would later highlight, and in those quiet moments, the kingdom began to see the subtle yet undeniable truth: she had mattered. Though Elisabeth Christine would never be remembered with the fanfare and reverence given to Friedrich the Great, she became, in the end, a symbol of quiet strength. She had carried the weight of monarchy for decades, and despite the kingdom's refusal to acknowledge her during her lifetime, she left a legacy of dignity, resilience, and grace. And as the generations passed, her story would be told not as the tragic tale of a queen forgotten, but as a story of a woman who stood firm, a silent yet powerful force in the history of Prussia. Her place in the grand tapestry of Prussian history may have been small, but it was no longer invisible. Elisabeth Christine's quiet contributions to the kingdom would live on in the hearts of those who understood that true strength often goes unseen, just as she had for most of her life. The years after Elisabeth Christine's passing saw the world shift dramatically. Prussia, under the rule of Friedrich Wilhelm II, faced new challenges, opportunities, and transformations. The Enlightenment ideals that had been so strongly championed by Friedrich the Great continued to shape the kingdom. But a new era was dawning. The monarch's reign was marked by reforms and efforts to modernize the country. Prussia began to transition from a kingdom shaped by military victories and intellectual movements to one with a more complex, increasingly industrial society. But for all these changes, the name Elisabeth Christine remained, for the most part, a faint echo in the corridors of history. History, as it is often written, is a story told through the actions of powerful men, their battles, their conquests, their philosophies. Women who served, who supported, who stood in the background, were often left behind, their contributions lost to the void of time. And though Elisabeth Christine had been a queen who had served diligently, ensuring the continuity of the monarchy when her husband was engaged in wars and reforms, her story was all but erased from the grand narrative of Prussian history. However, history has a way of revisiting the past. The currents of time may obscure certain figures, but truths have a way of surfacing. In the early 19th century, as a new generation of historians began to examine the reign of Friedrich the Great more critically, they began to consider the role of the queen consort, especially in times of crisis. Elisabeth Christine's story, once relegated to the margins, began to emerge from the shadows. She was no longer just the wife of a great monarch, she was recognized for her own quiet contributions to the survival of Prussia. In the growing field of historical research and scholarship, a different narrative of Prussian history began to take shape, one in which Elisabeth Christine's sacrifices were acknowledged. Historians who began to look beyond the military exploits and philosophical contributions of her husband turned their attention to her role during the 7 Years' War. When Prussia's very survival had depended on the unacknowledged labor of women like her, Elisabeth Christine had been a silent guardian, maintaining order, managing affairs of state, and ensuring that the kingdom did not fall into disarray. She had done so not out of a desire for recognition, but out of duty and devotion to a kingdom that had never valued her enough to see her contributions. It was in this rediscovery of the women behind the throne, the often unspoken pillars of monarchies, that Elisabeth Christine began to find her place in history. Her loyalty, resilience, and quiet strength were no longer viewed as mere footnotes but were embraced as vital aspects of the Prussian monarchy's survival. Still, the name Elisabeth Christine never reached the same heights of historical reverence as her husband's. Friedrich the Great would always be remembered as the military genius, the enlightened monarch who had reshaped Europe. His legacy was carved in stone. Elisabeth Christine, by contrast, was remembered as a silent figure, one whose contribution to the kingdom was often only acknowledged by those who understood that history is made not only by the kings who command armies but also by the queens who ensure that kingdoms do not fall apart in the moments of quiet crisis. Her name, though never emblazoned in the great texts of history, became a symbol of the forgotten loyalty that quietly held the fabric of power together. Her legacy was not one of political reforms or military victories, but of sustaining the kingdom when it most needed sustaining, of being a constant presence when all around her. The world changed, and her husband sought glory and fame. She was the one who carried the weight of tradition, the one who, though sidelined, had continued to act with dignity and grace. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, scholars began to look at her life with more compassion, recognizing that she had been a woman of quiet resolve, a figure who had made her own quiet mark on history. Elisabeth Christine was no longer simply an obscure queen consort, but a woman who had found strength in her silence, a figure of dignity whose contributions to the kingdom had been misunderstood in her time but were finally appreciated in the larger context of Prussian history. By the end of the 19th century, Elisabeth Christine's legacy was no longer one of neglect. While she did not stand in the same light as her husband or son, she was remembered as a woman who had been both invisible and indispensable. Perhaps in some way, this was her final victory, the recognition that her place in history, though small and quiet, was no less important. She had been the queen in the background, the unsung heroine, who did not need the adoration of the world because she had already given everything to the kingdom she had served. In the end, Elisabeth Christine's life was not forgotten, it was remembered differently, as it should have been all along. A woman's worth is not always measured by the spotlight she stands in, but by the lives she touches, the legacy she leaves behind in the quiet moments of duty, and the strength with which she endures the weight of history itself. Her story, though erased for so long, would now be told, not as a tragedy, but as a quiet triumph. A woman who had done her duty, not for recognition, but for a kingdom she loved. And in that, she had found her place in the history that had, for so long, overlooked her.